a department that mainly was devoted to espionage on the European continent when it was occupied by the Germans. This is the actual manual. It's called How to Become a Spy. They actually printed it up for recruits and for spy masters. And one of the chapters is called Handling, and it says this: payment should be on a business footing from the start. Although patriotism is the best motive to seek when recruiting agents, it is usually best to pay agents as well. They may need it, and it affords an additional means of controlling them. And it goes on into how much should be paid. So the notion of altruism or ideology is, I guess, overshadowed sometimes by the mercenary motive. I ended last week with the most famous spy, I think, in recent memory, and that would be the brother-in-law, as he was called. You remember the brother-in-law, the son-in-law. And I just might mention to end that in 2007, a trial was conducted in Israel about the merits of Ashron Marwan, the son-in-law. The court, June the 12th, 2007, was actually ruling on the merits of the book that had been published, which accused him of being a double agent. And they officially ruled against General Zira, who had an axe to grind, and ruled that, in fact, Marwan produced the goods for the money paid. So that ended that, but not for Marwan, who was killed, still having probably Egyptian intelligence, although his wife insisted afterwards that the Israelis did it, which is, the usual. Well, I'm going to go on a little bit today. The next motivation I want to talk about is fidelity to a cause. That is, the spies I'm going to mention today were all, and the cause that most attracted them was Marxism, communism. They were all communist agents who, in effect, performed during World War II as agents of the Soviet Union. Much of it has long been secret, as you can imagine, but lots of evidence has been published since the war. So we know a lot more about their activities than before. Let me say a word or two about the spies who operated inside of Nazi Germany. Not every German was a Nazi, we know that. There were a number, I won't even say a number, but there were some very brave Germans, mainly Marxists, who engaged from the beginning against Hitler. You might even be interested to know that the Abwehr, which was military intelligence, was loaded with anti-Nazis. The head of the Abwehr was a man named Admiral Canaris. In 1944, he was arrested by the SS intelligence services, along with his top lieutenants, and was hanged, he and his associates, for treason because of the contacts they maintained with a variety of anti-Nazi groups. It comes as something of a surprise, but I want to speak about several of the German groups that, in effect, maintained an allegiance to Marxism. You have to remember that, in essence, the appeal of Marxism-communism in the 1930s and 40s, in the wake of the Great Depression, many concluded that capitalism had absolutely failed. that the inequalities in wealth doomed the capitalist system, and that inevitably, as Marx had pointed out in his writings, the next revolution would be the revolution of the proletariat against the capitalist commercial manufacturing classes. And the Depression seemed to prove it. So there were numerous intellectuals, especially, who were attracted to Marxism. Marxism would be the end of history. You went through certain phases in history. There was an agrarian phase, which gave way to a commercial capitalist phase. The aristocratic landowning class was replaced by a capitalist, a business class, and they too would be overthrown by the next class to rise, the proletariat. And the communists, who understood the progression of history, would put themselves in the van of history by leading this new class, the proletariat, to dominion. And when that occurred, when the proletarian revolution occurred, that would be the end of history, because by that time you would have an elite who understood all this, as the masses did not. They would lead the way, an intellectual elite, and when they seized power, they would establish a temporary dictatorship in which all the means of production were transferred to the state. And in essence, the struggle that made history would end with the victory first of the proletariat, of the elite, that would in fact impose a dictatorship, and when all the means of production had been transferred, you would then emerge into a utopian society where people were essentially equal, were made to enjoy all the fruits of leisure, and so on. That was the Marxist philosophy. We know it didn't work in real life, that the dictatorship of the proletariat that was established by Lenin, continued then by Stalin, became a self-sustaining thing, and that the end of the state, the abolition of the state never occurred. But the vision, the intellectual foundations were very appealing to many intellectuals, especially in the aftermath of the Great Depression, which seemed to prove to many that Marx's prognostications were in fact becoming reality. And so that's why they maintained this allegiance to communism for so long, even looking at the horrors of Stalin's Russia in the 1930s, the Great Purge, the show trials, the delegation of the upper classes as non-persons and so on. They remained faithful to that ideal. Even long past it became apparent, even to many Russians, that it was an illusion and a fraud. So the appeal, and most of the people who became Marxists in the 20s and 30s, many of them intellectuals who believed in the original Marxist version, and then in a way had nothing, had no answer for what Stalin had done. The utopian vision was worth 1 million lives or 10 million lives. So we have to understand that setting and why so many people became not just communists, but became Russian agents. And I'll try to, illustrate that before the end of the hour. But let me just say a word or two about the anti-Nazi spies. There were several rings in Germany that sent information through the Russian military attaché in Berlin in the 1930s. One was known as the Red Orchestra, the Rote Kapelle, was led by a man named Arvid Harnack. He was a lawyer, an economist, had studied in the United States at the University of Wisconsin, married an American, an instructor at the university named Mildred Fish in 1926. He was a convinced communist. He returned to Germany, moved in very high circles because many of the former elite, the aristocracy of Germany really looked down their noses at Hitler, this upstart, this nobody from nowhere who had seized power. He joined the Nazi Party, as they were instructed to do, to disguise his true identity as a communist. And he gathered small groups, 3-4 people throughout Germany, who passed information to the Russians, beginning in the late 1930s. There was a second ring led by a man named Schulze Boysen. He was a grandson of Admiral Tirpitz, who was the great builder of the German Navy in World War I. He had a senior post in the Air Ministry, and he also passed information to the Soviet minister in Berlin. He was so aristocratic, so up the food chain, that Göring actually gave the bride away at his wedding in 1936. He also had contact with Abwehr officers in the 30s, who also came from the old German aristocracy, intellectuals who were opposed to Hitler, and he moved inside of German circles of, the top. So a lot of information was passed along in the late 30s and early 40s. The Russian intelligence officers often didn't pass the information on to Stalin because they feared for their lives if they were mistaken. So a lot of the info didn't get to the top. For instance, one of the things that they passed along was the date for the German invasion of Russia, Barbarossa. And Stalin refused to accept it. He had a treaty with Hitler. Adolf wouldn't treat him in this fashion. And so they missed on that one. But nevertheless, both of these ran networks through Germany. They forged links with the Dietrich Bonhoeffer group. You probably know of him. The White Rose, do you know that at all? That was a group in Munich of young students who thought that they must act against the regime for the honor of Germany. They passed leaflets. They did very, it appeared like minor things, but nevertheless they were arrested and guillotined. That was a punishment that was introduced by Hitler for spying. Someone said this: the Russians had a shaft to a gold mine, but they never entirely utilized it. Stalin was so suspicious that he never trusted even his own spies. Well, apparently both networks were rolled up. After the war began with Russia, they could no longer go to transmit to the Russian embassy, and so they had to use a wireless, and German intelligence attached to the SS rolled it up. And apparently both were broken in 42. Something like 117 people were arrested. The Russian codes now were in German hands, and both of these groups were wiped out. The Harnack, who was the head of the Red Orchestra, said to his wife, despite everything, he looked back on a life in which darkness was outweighed by the light. 116 were interrogated, half were hanged. His wife was apparently given a 6-year prison sentence on the basis that she didn't know everything he was doing. Nevertheless, Hitler intervened personally. He wanted her dead too. And so there was a retrial, and she was beheaded in 1943 at the age of 40. Her last words were, quote, "And I have loved Germany so much." Well, after the end of the Red Orchestra, there was another spy ring in Switzerland called Lucy. That remained a source, an operating source, although the Swiss were very nervous about a possible German invasion. They didn't want to cross the Germans too much, so they kept it tightly under wraps. But nevertheless, there were some sources that continued to supply the Allies with information. The most famous of all the spies, maybe of the whole century, was a man named Richard Sorge. S-O-R-G-E. I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly. He was a model for James Bond. Ian Fleming apparently knew of him. Ian Fleming, the author, was a member of MI5 he was a spy during World War II. And apparently he had heard of Sergei. He called him, quote, the most formidable spy in history. Modeled James Bond on him. Although Sergei himself preferred Rhett Butler. He gave Gone with the Wind to a lady friend, of whom he had many, to read, and he said, don't you think I am just like Rhett Butler? I don't know what she said, but nevertheless. He was, I'll give you something about his life story, a short version. He was born in 1895. His father was German, but his mother was Russian. He was born in Central Asia, in one of the Russian states there. Badly wounded in World War I, fighting for the Germans, won the Iron Cross. In 1919, he was in the hospital, and as he put it, he plunged into an intense confusion of the soul. And when the confusion cleared, he joined the German Communist Party, which was one of the few parties that was fighting the far right in 1919 and 1920. In the 1920s, having joined the Communist Party, he spent some time in Moscow, and he was recruited by Russian military intelligence, the GRU. I might mention also that his grandfather had been an associate of Marx and Engels. That was going back several generations. And isn't it interesting that the Germans would apparently accept him as one of their own, and with no investigation of this background. This is what one associate said. He is a true communist. He is a man who can destroy even his best friend for the sake of communism. This is the judgment of a contemporary. Max Hastings has just written a book called The Secret War, which is about intelligence in World War II, and it runs about 700 pages. So this is what he said. Like most secret agents, Sergei was an abnormal human being who gained an emotional charge from his complex existence and multiple deceits, a remarkable personality. This is Stalin on Sergei, a drunk and a pimp. Okay, he was a complex figure. This was his stated creed: to free the world from capitalist imperialism and make wars impossible in the future. All difficulties, shortages, and mistakes in the Soviet Union were only regrettable transnational phenomena. So he excused it, remained a devoted spy to the end. All right, 1920, he's sent to Shanghai. He has a PhD in political science. He's a very literate and intelligent individual, very handsome man, very comfortable on all levels of society. Moves to Shanghai as the editor of a German news service in Shanghai and a correspondent for the Frankfurter Zeitung. But he was also charged with setting up an intelligence network in Shanghai and aspiring in Shanghai to keep Moscow informed of what was happening within China, because it was in a revolutionary upheaval too. In 1933, he was sent to Tokyo as correspondent for a German newspaper. In the interim, he had joined the Nazi Party. He moved in German circles in Tokyo. He was on extremely good terms with the German ambassador. And he apparently was asked to study the question of whether Tokyo planned an attack on Russia. He recruited a top flight ring. He had a radio operator, Max Clausen. His wife Anna was the courier. Sumi Ozaki was a member of the cabinet, Premier Konoya's cabinet. He was the only individual executed, this Ozaki, for treason by the Japanese when the ring was rolled up in World War II. So he was also very important. The Russians attached great importance to this ring because he was on the inside, and there was worry about a Japanese attack on the Soviet Union. In 1938, there was a battle in Manchuria, Nomonhan. The Japanese troops clashed with the Russian army stationed there. The Japanese were badly beaten, mauled. The Russians were highly trained and guarding that frontier. And apparently, the Sergei had visited Manchuria, and he had apparently been in a position to send all kinds of information about the Japanese formations. So he played a role in this Soviet victory. Nevertheless, the Russians remained worried that there would be a Japanese attack on Siberia. They were fearful of a joint Japanese-German action against the USSR. Sergei assured them that they had nothing to worry about, that the Japanese would not escalate, that they were looking further south where there was where raw materials like oil were to be had. Well, as a result of that incident in Manchuria, the Japanese canceled their Go North policy. Moscow was informed, and Stalin was now free to sign a pact with Hitler and march into Poland. His rear, he assumed, was now secured. The Japanese were not a threat. If they had remained a threat, he would not have marched into Poland. So the threat was over. Late 1941, warnings come to Stalin from his spies in England and Tokyo that the Germans are planning to attack Russia. March the 5th, 1941, Sergei sends microfilm documents indicating that the Germans will attack Russia in the middle of June. The response from Stalin: "We doubt the veracity of your information." Stalin didn't like him. He had a very wild lifestyle. This is what Stalin said: "He's not an ace spy. He's a bastard who set up factories and brothels in Japan and even deigned to report the date of the German attack. Are you suggesting I should believe him?" Sergei didn't understand why. Why didn't Stalin react? His nerves began to shatter. He started a lot of drinking, heavy drinking, the Japanese secret making mistakes. The secret police were beginning to close in. So it was a wild period from 41 into the beginning of 41. Okay. The Germans have invaded Russia. Barbarossa has begun. The spies were right. Stalin was wrong. Stalin had gotten the date of the invasion not only from Tokyo, but from the Red Orchestra in Germany as well. Now, couldn't happen. Adolf wouldn't do that to me. The invasion thus came as an enormous shock. The officers who had tried to alert him mainly were liquidated. He could not admit a mistake. December the 2nd, 1941, the Wehrmacht is marching through Russia. They are 11 miles from Moscow on December the 2nd of 1941. Now comes another information load from Sergei in Tokyo. Under no account will the Japanese attack. They are going to move south by the end of the year. Now, this is December 2nd, 1941. Pearl Harbor's only, a week away? Absolutely, there is no chance. There will be no Japanese attack into Manchuria, and the Go South strategy has won the day. It sent a very detailed approach, first-hand information. The Kwangtung Army, that's the Japanese army, has decided not to have a war with Russia. Now, the great decision. The Germans are within sight of the spires of St. Basil in Moscow. They're ready to begin the final assault, as Napoleon did many years before. Stalin now finally has to listen to the pimp, whatever he called him. He takes a big chance. Guarding the frontier with Japan are specially trained troops. They have been taught to train in snow. They have white uniforms that blend with the snow. There is a very large number of these troops that are available. They've been maintained in Siberia or in Manchuria because they are fearful of a Japanese attack. Now Stalin decides to take a chance. He will move these troops to the defense of Moscow. He will strip bare his frontier in Siberia and move these unbloody troops from Siberia to the defense of Moscow. The Germans now have approached Moscow, and suddenly, the city incidentally has been evacuated except for a handful of leaders. Suddenly, they are confronted by these fresh troops dressed in snow-white uniforms, on horseback, completely new to the battle, but willing to defend Moscow. It's the turning point in the Russian campaign. The Germans now, having seen the spires, they begin to retreat. Napoleon's troops had gotten into the city, as you know. There they were confronted by sappers and so on, but they never quite got in. They saw the spires, and now they begin this retreat. For many historians, that is the turning point in the German campaign. Of course, Stalingrad is still to come, but nevertheless, this turning point, because undoubtedly there was nothing to oppose them unless, now this is, I guess, one of the great coups of espionage in history. He saved many, credit him. His last message, the Japanese were getting close though. The police were closing in on the ring. Sergei himself began to drink heavily, raced around Tokyo on his motorbike. They began now rounding up the ring. One of the members of the ring was arrested by the Japanese, tortured, and he came clean about what had happened. On October 4th, Sergei sent his, that was, I guess, 41. He sent his last message to Moscow. He was then arrested. A lot of the members of the ring confessed. The trial was held in the summer of 42, and the Japanese really didn't want to execute him. So they contacted, through third-party channel, they contacted Stalin and said, would you like to trade spies? You have 3 of ours, and we will trade. And Richard Sorge will be traded. The answer that came back from Stalin was, never heard of the guy. The Japanese held him for 3 years. He never forgave him for predicting Barbarossa, the date of Barbarossa, which made him look bad. He was kept alive for 3 years, reasonably well treated, but on November the 7th of 1944, he was hanged. And his last words were, in Japanese, long live the revolution, long live communism, long live the world revolution, and so on. Now, many historians, Alistair Horn, for example, said this was the most critical piece of information that any agent passed during the war. In 1964, Sergei was awarded the supreme decoration of Hero of the Soviet Union. A street in Moscow is named for him, and they put his face on a postage stamp. So that was a little too late for him, but the evaluation of Horn is, it was a turning point in the battle. That was the battle for Moscow. If not with hindsight, a turning point in the whole war had been reached. So this gives you an idea of the critical nature of espionage. But of course, you have to use it. And this was apparently came up against Stalin's ego. Any questions so far?